Hello! Over the past year, I've made a bunch of videos all going over the internal structure and mechanics of Terraria. All of them are about completely different things, but they're all related in the topic of peering inside Terraria. This video fits them all together as a singular compilation. I originally wanted to make it a playlist, but those aren't pushed together, so here we are. I've also organized them into related subgroups. Whether you're here for the full time, part of it, or just rewatching, I hope you enjoy. This is the Angler, and these are his clothes. Despite being utter trash combat-wise, these actually serve an important purpose elsewhere. When equipped, they give fishing power and reduce enemy spawn rates near you. This makes them the ideal armor for fishing, and with the advent of loadouts in 1.4.4 making it more convenient than ever to maintain a permanent fishing loadout, Angler armor is now essential for any dedicated or even casual fisher in Terraria. To get the Angler set, all you need to do is finish 20 Angler quests on your character. You get the Angler hat on your 10th quest, the Angler vest on the 15th quest, and the Angler pants on the 20th. In all, not too hard to obtain. However, unlike most Angler drops, these rewards are one-time. Sure, the golden fishing rod may be guaranteed on the 30th quest, but after the 75th quest, there's always a 0.4% chance of getting it. The bottomless water bucket may be guaranteed on the 25th quest, but it's always available with a 1.43% chance after the 10th quest. Unlike these, the Angler armor pieces are guaranteed once on a certain quest number, and they are then never obtainable ever again. Due to this, in single player, you can only get one Angler set per character. Full stop. However, that isn't exactly true. If you really want to, you can theoretically get 2 Angler sets on the same player in single player without cheating. All it'll take is a little bit of work. Internally, the number of Angler quests a player has completed is stored as a signed 32-bit integer. Now, normally this is completely unremarkable, but unlike other in-game counters, like golf score or the tax collector, they forgot to cap this one. This means quite a few funny things can happen. If we go ahead and complete 2,147,483,648 Angler quests, the Angler quest counter will, quote, overflow. A 32-bit signed integer can only store a positive number up to 2,147,483,647. So if you complete an Angler quest while at the limit, the counter simply can't store that number and will overflow, all the way from 2,147,483,647 quests, all the way down to negative 2,147,483,648 quests. You'll actually notice the effect of this in-game somewhat. First, the Angler no longer tells you how many quests you've completed. That dialogue option is only available if you've completed 2 or more quests. You'll also notice that the Angler will no longer drop any rare quest rewards. This is because Angler quest drop rates are modified by your quest count, and if the quest count is negative, funny things happen. At negative 2,147,483,648 quests, Angler drops become 21.47 million times rarer than normal, so you'll basically never get any. Instead, you'll only get potions. How fun. Anyway, back to your second Angler set. Even that you're now in the negatives, you can still keep completing Angler quests. The counter will still tick up, one by one. Another 2,147,483,647 quests later, your counter should tick all the way back to -1 quests completed. Completing another quest now will bring you back to 0, and boom, your fortune is now reset. The game will now believe you've never completed a single Angler quest on this player, and thus you can claim your one-time rewards once more. You can get another fuzzy carrot at 5 quests, another Angler hat at 10, another Angler vest at 15, and another Angler pants at 20. After completing just shy of 4.3 billion Angler quests, you can finally claim your rightful second set of Angler armor. Assuming, very generously, that each Angler quest takes 6 minutes to complete, completing 4,294,967,316 Angler quests would take approximately 49,000 years to complete without any breaks. That's quite a while, I must say. But it's still theoretically possible, as far as I can tell, and that's what matters here. Happy fishing! What happens when you overflow the Dryad's corruption counter? If you didn't know, the Dryad's corruption counter can actually exceed 100% corrupt, since her calculations incorrectly exclude non-solid evil blocks while counting. This means it's possible to have a world be more than 100% corrupt, since there are more evil blocks than solid blocks. From here, we can then push the corruption counter to reach as high as 255% corrupt, crimsoned, and or hollow. This is because Terraria stores the Dryad's percentages as an unsigned byte, which with its 8 bits can only store numbers up to 255. Due to this, the Dryad will only ever show a world as up to 255% corrupt, crimsoned, and or hollow. However, there's nothing stopping us from pushing it further. A 255% corrupt world would have 2.55 times more corrupt blocks than solid blocks. In practice, this would be something like 51 corrupt thorns and 20 stone blocks, or 255 corrupt thorns and 100 stone blocks. So what happens if we just add another corrupt thorn? This should be a 256% corrupt world in the eyes of the Dryad, but because an unsigned byte can't store a value of 256, it should overflow, putting the value back at 0. Looking at this, it seems to be possible to achieve a perfectly pure world by actually making it more corrupt, overflowing the counter to trick the Dryad into thinking it's completely pure, which would be very funny. Unfortunately, that's not quite what happens. If you do actually overflow the counter to 256%, it doesn't reset to 0%, but instead 1%. Huh? How did that happen? This is because of a special edge case in the Dryad's code. If the Dryad's code would say the world is 0% evil, but there is at least one evil block somewhere in the world, the Dryad will insist the world is actually 1% evil. This is to ensure the world is actually pure before declaring it so, as otherwise any world less than 0.5% evil would round down to 0% in the code and erroneously be declared pure, even when it isn't. Unfortunately, this also makes it impossible to overflow our way into purity, as with more than one evil block in the world, the Dryad will insist the world is not pure, even when the calculation gives us 0%. While this ending is quite sad for both Dryad haters and weird exploit lovers alike, it does make for some funny scenarios. For example, this world, which consists of 20,159,744 Crimson Thorns and one stone block for the Dryad to stand on. In Dryad math, this world should be about 2,015,974,400% Crimson, while in human math, this world is 99.999% Crimson. Despite literally the entire world being nothing but floating evil surrounding her and her 2 precious stone blocks preventing her from falling into the infinite abyss of her own creation, the Dryad will still confidently assert the world to be 1% Crimson, because all of this still overflows that byte back to 0. A true persistent case of the blind Dryad, if you ask me. I guess this isn't as cool as sticking to the Dryad by purifying a world with evil, but I guess this is the best we'll get. What happens to your character when you have negative HP? Well, normally, you die, since the only way to, if briefly, achieve negative HP is to get hit for more health than you have. Within the core gameplay of Terraria, this is the only way to get negative HP, and, well, it doesn't exactly last very long. However, using certain external methods, it is possible to get a character to somewhat stably have a negative HP value. By using an inventory editor to set the max HP of your character to a negative value, you can actually enter a Terraria world with negative HP preset. As the check to kill you for having negative health doesn't actually run until a damage tick is processed, you don't die instantly upon loading in, meaning you can actually play the game with negative HP. Just like that. Negative HP Terraria. Of course, this doesn't mean that wacky things don't happen when you try to play the game with negative HP. In fact, there's quite a bit of unintended behavior if you try. So that's what we're going to look at today. What happens to your character if you stay at negative HP? Let's start from 0 HP and slowly make our way all the way down to the negative integer limit, negative 2,147,483,648 HP. At 0 HP, things are quite tame. As expected, if you take any damage, you die, since even a 1 damage tick would send you negative. However, what is weird is that your health bar, both the life counter and the hearts themselves, completely disappears. It's just not there. You might have noticed similar behavior to this in 1 HP hardcore runs before. At absurdly low HP caps, the health GUI simply refuses to render. Overall, being at 0 HP isn't actually materially any different than being at 1 HP. You die in 1 hit, health bar doesn't render, yada yada. There isn't really anything new here, but things will start to get wacky once you get into true negatives. Our next stop is at negative 20 HP. Here, you'll notice that suddenly, our health bar is back. Well, at least a part of it is. The hearts themselves are still gone. This is because 20 HP is equal to a full heart in Terraria. With at least 1 full heart to render on the health bar, Terraria's health GUI wakes up and actually starts existing again. On the positive side, this all works properly, with 20 HP showing 1 heart and the corresponding counter. However, at negative HP, it bugs out a bit. The life counter shows up properly at negative 20 HP, but the hearts themselves don't. I guess this has something to do with the game trying to render a negative amount of hearts and therefore not rendering any, but I could be wrong. Either way, at negative 20 HP and lower, the life counter begins to work. As you lower your HP more and more, you won't actually notice any abrupt changes at any specific number. I mean, what special numbers are there between negative 20 and a negative integer limit? What can even happen? Surely there can't be that much unintended behavior. Oh. Yeah, you just died right after logging in, so what gives? Well, let's talk about natural regeneration. Normally, natural regeneration slowly increments your health passively over time, and is quite helpful in pretty much all cases. However, here it does pretty much the exact opposite. Look up the formula for natural regeneration, and you'll find that it is based on your max HP. More HP, more regen to fill up at a reasonable pace. A good mechanic. However, if your max HP is negative, that means your natural regeneration is negative too. Yes, this means at negative max HP, your natural regeneration actually hurts you. When you're at negative max HP, as soon as you quote naturally regenerate a single point of HP, you will immediately die as you're dealt 1 point of damage, causing a damage update. The amount of damage this takes depends on your max HP. The higher it is, the faster you'll reach the quote healing tick, and the faster you'll die. At low negative values, it takes quite a long time to succumb, as it takes quite a while to build up to the minimum 0.5 HP per second needed to give a quote healing tick with such low max HP. But at higher values, you'll die immediately after the 5-second regeneration cooldown is over. If you equip buffs that speed up regeneration time, like the Crimson Armor or sitting in a chair, you can die even faster than that. Oh, and because natural regen build-up time doesn't reset on death, once you die the first time, you'll keep dying in an infinite loop. Cool. So yeah, between negative 20 and a negative integer limit, it's basically a whole lot of death by natural regen, which is kind of funny to say. At some point, you should consider giving yourself the bleeding debuff just so that you can actually survive. Other than the natural regen damage progressively getting more and more ridiculous, there isn't actually much to see here as we go more and more into the negatives. So let's spare the time and move on to our next milestone. Our second to last stop is at quite an odd number indeed, negative 2,147,483,249 HP, which is 399 from the negative integer limit. For some reason that is absolutely beyond me, at this exact number, the health bar begins to render again. It renders as if you had a full set of life fruit, which would typically be 500 HP, which would somewhat make sense if this were 500 HP from the negative integer limit. However, this occurs not 500 HP from the limit, not even 400 HP, but 399 HP from the limit, which is just baffling. On top of this, if you switch the health interface to the old 1.3 style hearts, all of the hearts render weird and oversized. Huh? All of this is just something I discovered while testing, and I have absolutely no explanation for it. Finally, we arrive at our last stop, the negative 32-bit integer limit, negative 2,147,483,648 HP. Remember, 2's complement. This is the lowest possible HP value you can assign to the Terraria character. Behavior changes dramatically at this stage. Instead of dying from every possible damage tick, we instead become completely invincible. You can still take damage, it ticks, but you just don't die. This is probably caused by one of my favorite computer things, an integer underflow. If you take damage at the negative integer limit, it will attempt to decrease your health. Normally this lands at 0 or some negative and kills you, but as there can't be a number lower than negative integer limit, it instead underflows into a positive number. That's right, taking damage at the negative integer limit sets you to positive HP. Due to this, you don't die from the hit, since, well, you still have positive HP. The game then immediately recognizes you have more HP than your max HP, and quickly sets you back to your max HP. In the end, this means your health just doesn't change at all if you take damage, and thus you become completely invincible. This behavior isn't actually unique to the negative integer limit itself. For example, if I take 500 or more damage while having negative 2,147,483,149 max HP, it'll still underflow and I'll survive. The player can survive any amount of damage if it underflows the health counter. It's just that this behavior is most exemplified at a negative integer limit since, well, all damage, even 1 ticks, would underflow the counter at that point. Around now, you'll also notice these massive clouds of 4 damage ticks surround you. These are actually the natural regen damage ticks we talked about before, just turned up to max because of our insane max HP value. You can actually get and see and admire them now, since unlike every other health value, you can't die to them anymore. I bet you've never seen this many damage ticks in a single place in your life. So, these are the wonky things that happen whenever a character has negative HP. As I said previously, unintended behavior. If you want to play around a negative HP, you can use any inventory editor to edit a character. TerraSaver is a default option, although for this video I used TerraPlur by FilipK, who also suggested the idea for this video in my Discord. Thank you. TerraPlur Edit also runs faster than TerraSaver from my experience, meaning rapid edits should be a bit less painful. Also, do note that negative HP characters only work properly in vanilla Terraria, not modded Terraria. In Tmod, all negative HP characters are automatically reset to positive, sadly. So, make sure you do that. So, a few weeks ago, I made a video about negative HP in Terraria. You can get negative health by editing your player file in vanilla Terraria, and from there it causes quite a few neat side effects that made for an interesting and full video. This video will kind of act as a part 2 to that video. You don't necessarily need to watch the other one to understand this one, but it'll definitely help contextualize the subject a bit. You can get there with this card, and the end screen of the other video should bring you back here. Anyway though, what we're going to discuss in this video is the Lifeforce potion, specifically what happens when you drink a Lifeforce potion on negative HP. I mean, it is the only buff in the game that affects your max HP, so surely it should have some interesting effects too, right? And indeed it does, and quite a lot more than I initially thought. So let's start at the beginning. At its core, what does the Lifeforce potion do? Well, in the tin, it's quite simple. It increases your max life by 20%, clear as day. But we can be a bit more specific than that. What the Lifeforce potion actually does is increase your max HP by 20 for every 100 max HP you have. In general gameplay, this just means you get a little less HP than you'd be otherwise getting, say going from 415 to 495 HP instead of 498 HP, but in this context it means something different. It means the Lifeforce potion doesn't actually always increase your HP like a tin says. Just like how it gives plus 20 max HP for every 100 max HP, it also subtracts your HP by 20 for every negative 100 max HP you have. Yes, Lifeforce decreases your HP when you have negative max HP. This unintended behavior is core to all the strange behavior we'll be looking at today, because, well, you can only decrease HP so much, right? Say you set your health to a negative integer limit, negative 2,147,483,648 HP. This is where we left off last video. As the negative integer limit, it is physically impossible for your HP to get any lower. So what happens if we use the Lifeforce potion to force it to go lower? Well, what happens if the number wraps around, all the way from the lowest possible number to the highest possible number? This is called an integer underflow. We talked about this a bit last video in regards to taking damage while close to or at the negative integer limit. Because taking damage this close to the limit underflows your HP to a positive number, you don't actually die from hits, making you invincible, which is really neat to see. However, in that case, the damage tick underflow and subsequent reset happens so fast that you don't actually get to see your HP change. Underflowing your HP with a Lifeforce potion is neat because you actually get to see the overflow. Drink a Lifeforce potion at negative 2,147,483,648 max HP, and you'll subtract 429,496,720 max HP away, underflowing the value and leaving you with positive 1,717,986,928 max HP. Wow. You'll also see your current HP value race up at an astonishing pace. Since natural regeneration is based off your max HP, it's insanely borked when you have a billion number health cap. Of course, it still takes a while to fill since you also have billions of HP to regenerate, but it's cool to see the numbers fly. If instead you want to instantly reach max HP though, you can put on bleeding to stop the regeneration and then damage tick underflow to instantly reach max HP. You could also talk to the nurse, but she'll refuse to heal you, naturally. Lastly, you'll notice your heart icons are a bit weird. The hearts themselves disappear completely in all styles, leaving only the life text left, and in classic mode, it's even weirder, as the life text is somehow forced far to the left for some reason. I don't know why this happens, but it's really interesting to see nonetheless. What's funny about this whole situation is that through this, it's actually possible to reach the HP values negative 2 billion through 600 and 1.7 billion through 2.1 billion on any Terraria character, but not the values in between. You see, Terraria normally doesn't allow you to set max HP values above 500. Even with an inventory editor, it simply rejects it and caps it to 500. The only way to reach health values above 600, full life root plus life force, is by underflowing, which only reaches as low as 1.717 billion HP. I just think it's interesting that while you can reach the extremes of max HP in both ways, no matter what you do, you can't get 601 HP. Anyways, back on topic. If you thought that integer underflows were the only interesting thing that Lifeforce potions cause, you'd be wrong. Let's get to negative 2,147,483,248 HP, 400 away from the negative integer limit. If you watch the other video, you'll know that this is where the full gold hearts that show near the integer limit suddenly disappear for some reason. Well, another neat thing happens here when you drink a Lifeforce potion. At first, you might think nothing interesting has happened. The hearts GUI in the top corner has come back, albeit with the hearts depleted. That's new, neat, but what else though? So you go to your interface menu and go to the health bar settings to see how else the health bar UI could have changed. You click the button and... What? The game just fucking froze. What? Oh, it's back. Well, back as in running at half a frame per second. Excuse me, what? It turns out that if you have between negative 2,147,483,248 HP and negative 1,789,569,709 HP, drinking a Lifeforce potion immediately causes the game to completely piss shit and die, if you're using either the classic or Bar's health bar styles. For some reason, using the fancy style doesn't do anything, just showing 20 depleted golden hearts. This happens regardless of whether you switch to the style while having the buff active, or whether you drink it while having the style active. In both instances, the game will seize up. Why does this happen? I don't know, but I suspect it has something to do with health bar rendering. Either way, I'm wholly unqualified to explain that. As stated before, this effect keeps going on until you reach negative 1,789,569,708 HP. The first HP value from the bottom, where drinking a Lifeforce potion is no longer enough to underflow HP values. Instead, it just ends up decreasing your HP by roughly 20%, like normal. Aside from another unexpectedly weird UI glitch, from here, I believe there isn't actually that much that happens. The whole phenomenon isn't as thick as the original video, but still interesting nonetheless and equally puzzling. If you want to play with this yourself, use any inventory editor with a copy of vanilla Terraria. Tmod unfortunately rejects negative HP characters. Terraria files are full of little attributes to define what they are. For players, this would be stuff like max HP, total playtime, or golf score, and for world files, this would be things like its creation date or NPC data. Now, during normal play, the effects and behavior relating to these attributes are pretty well defined and standard. After all, Terraria is a pretty well polished and not terribly buggy game. But what if we screw around just a bit? That is, what happens if we externally modify certain attributes to illegal values they would never take during normal play? Certainly there would be unintended behavior. After all, Red never expected the game to handle these illegal values, right? In the past on this channel, I've probably covered the biggest case of illegal value insertion in the game, negative HP values. That alone caused an insane amount of unintended behavior, enough for 15 minutes worth at least. Now in this video, instead of covering one big glitch, I'll be covering 3 other illegal value insertions in the player and world files. They aren't nearly as crazy as negative HP, but they each individually still have their own interesting unintended behavior to explore, as well as the code behind them. So, let's get in. Our first value is the rather unassuming hairstyle. In Terraria, there are 165 hairstyles, each numbered with the ID 0 through 164. What we'll do now is simple. Change our player's hairstyle to something that isn't in this inclusive range. This would specify a hairstyle that is undefined in the game's code. So, what happens? What will it show? After all, you can't draw a hairstyle with no defined graphics, right? Will it just draw some default hairstyle like ID 0? Will it just draw some junk data, or will it crash? What do you think? Well, if you guessed option 3, you're right. As soon as the game tries drawing a player with an undefined hairstyle, typically when you scroll to the character in the player selection menu, the game immediately crashes. Interestingly, this crash shows itself to be an index out of range exception, meaning the crash is caused by Terraria trying to access data outside the bounds of a list. Huh. If you follow the traceback to the relevant code, you can actually see why this happens. Here, asking for a negative index, or an index greater than 164 from the hairstyle list that only has the valid indexes 0 to 164, would, of course, cause an out-of-bounds error. Huh. Neat. Our next value is similar in concept, but acts completely differently. Player style. Player style, internally called skin variant, is a single value from 0 to 9 that defines both the gender of your character, either male or female, and its clothing style, which is one of these 5 available. For your information, TerraSaver also calls this value gender plus clothes because, well, it determines your gender in clothes. There are 2 interesting things about this value. Firstly, if you play around with the values, you realize there are actually 2 player styles that are completely unachievable in normal gameplay. IDs 10 and 11, internally called display dolls, are hidden player styles that resemble a darkened, faceless mannequin or a mannequin of some sort. They're fully functional too. I can only assume they remain as the result of some kind of scrapped code or unused feature. All that's left is speculation on what they were for, I guess. Anyway, secondly, now let's try to input actually legal values, like -1 to 11, the integer limit, or 300 million. What happens then? Does it also crash, just like the hairstyles? Well, no, actually. In fact, it just works, but weirdly. For most values, you'll just end up with a Womanikin skin, but sometimes, like in the case of 300 million, it actually ends up being the default style, ID 0. Huh? There are 2 reasons for this. First, despite being a 32-bit signed integer, player styles are actually saved to the file as an 8-bit unsigned byte, meaning they can really only take the value from 0 to 255. Any values outside of this get their higher bits chopped off in the bit cast in an effective modulo operation. This explains why 300 million corresponds to the default style 0, since casting the integer 300 million to a byte results in the value 0. Second, there's a clamp. If the style value is over the maximum valid player style 11, it'll just set it to 11. This is why, unlike hairstyles, drawing or even just accessing undefined values doesn't crash the game, because it fixes them beforehand. Hell, even the method name says that. This also explains why most invalid values end up being a Womanikin, because, well, 95.3% of them end up mapping to that. It's interesting behavior, certainly. The third and last value we'll be looking at is actually a world attribute and comes courtesy of FilipK's exploration. You might know that Terraria worlds are mostly static, that is, made of blocks, but can save some dynamic elements in them, NPC data. In the world files, this data is stored after the tile data, with each entry consisting of a bunch of relevant information. What we care about though is this, the NPC's ID. This stores the type of NPC the NPC actually is. So what happens if we change it? Will it actually just spawn whatever NPC we put in? Yes. If I change the NPC ID of the guide, 16, to that of SkeletRon's head, 35, and enter the world, the game will indeed spawn SkeletRon as I load the world. Since spawning SkeletRon's head causes his AI to spawn his arms too, they also appear. Now, what's funny about this is that the NPC still spawns with the same parameters. Like the same name. You know, I never heard of a SkeletRon named Brandon until today, but there he is, right in front of me. He's having a great time right now, too. This works with any NPC in the game. Spawn the Moonlord's core, and the Moonlord will spawn upon opening the world. He's also called Brandon, by the way. The Destroyer's head will bring along the whole rest of the worm, although only the head will be called Brandon. And you can even choose to spawn Brandon, the mysterious tablet, which brings along his unfortunately unnamed cult worshippers, too. This invalid value is more just fun than the others. As far as I can tell, there's no way to crash the game with this, as entering any invalid NPC ID will just cause the world to fail to load. It just allows you to make any NPC you want spawn in automatically upon loading the world. I'm sure that someone can make use of this to make some cracked world that does tons of weird stuff upon loading. Y'all are far more creative and smarter than me. So that's the 3 illegal, or at least unexpected values, 2 player values and 1 world attribute. I bet you would never think you'd ponder clothing style code in Terraria, but you just did. At least to me, this game will always have minutiae that are interesting. This is a typical, normal, healthy Plantera. And this is a Plantera in For the Worthy. Notice any differences? The For the Worthy Plantera's tentacles have the unique habit of vibrating, almost frozen in place in a rough circle. Compared to the more fluid and familiar nature of normal Plantera, with its tentacles swinging side to side, it looks quite strange in comparison. It's almost like if Plantera decided to build a tentacle wall for some reason. So why does Plantera act like this? Well, according to the Terraria wiki, it's because Plantera's tentacle speed is dramatically increased, which somehow makes her tentacles fix themselves in a circle around Plantera. Huh. While this explanation gets some of the way there, it isn't exactly correct. For the worthy, Plantera's tentacles actually have increased acceleration, not speed, And once you consider that, it begins to make a lot more sense why For the Worthy Plantera's tentacles vibrate like that. How Plantera's tentacles AI works is that they will always choose a target position to move toward. This spot will always be some set distance from Plantera or her hook, depending on the tentacle's HP, difficulty settings, and Plantera's HP. You can see this here in action on this neutered Plantera with only one tentacle. The tentacle repeatedly accelerates toward its target position, occasionally refreshing every now and then to a different spot the same distance from Plantera. Note how I said accelerates though. The tentacle does not move toward its target, but it accelerates toward it. As long as it is moving toward its target, it is speeding up towards it. When it reaches its target, it still has speed, meaning it will overshoot its target. Now that it's overshot though, of course, it then accelerates back toward the target, overshooting again, and repeat. Then a bit of a dampening/braking effect is applied, so eventually their swinging slows and they coalesce around a singular position, all before moving toward a new spot as a new target is chosen every 2 to 8 seconds. This is what gives tentacles their characteristic swinging behavior, swinging back and forth in swarm position. So how does For the Worthy bork this? In For the Worthy, tentacle acceleration is massively increased, and I mean massively. In normal mode, tentacles have an acceleration of 0.2 pixels per tick squared. Expert mode and higher, that's more than double to 0.5 pixels per tick squared. But in For the Worthy, it's increased to 4.5 pixels per tick squared, 22.5 times normal. So instead of swinging around their target positions, they vibrate around them. Why? Well, once the target is reached, instead of slowly decelerating and swinging back, they suddenly and quickly break due to the massive acceleration buff. Remember, acceleration goes both ways, speeding up and braking. They then instantly rocket back toward the target and pass it again almost instantly braking again and repeat. Basically, due to the massive acceleration buff, the swings become much shorter and much more frequent. This ends up looking like a vibration or spasm of the tentacles, which never get very far from the target position, freezing them in place, like we see. I have no clue if this was intentional when it was first programmed, but it is definitely an interesting dynamic to the revamped boss fight. I don't know if it actually adds the difficulty that much, but it is definitely quite fun to look at. You might remember that when 1.4.4 released, the Daytime Empress of Light suddenly got a lot harder. This is because, in that update, Relogic made the Daytime Empress's attacks ignore dodging mechanics, which means you could no longer cheat death using Hollowed Armor, Master Ninja Gear, or Brain of Confusion. Instead of getting a free dodge every 30 seconds, which often meant several dodges through the fight, plus another 25% chance to dodge any other attack, you now had to true no-hit the Empress of Light. No funny business allowed, which is, of course, significantly harder. Although the Empress of Light is by far the most well-known and consequential example, Relogic made this apply to more than just the Empress. Their intention was to make any quote insta-kill enemy, like the Empress, bypass dodges. As you know, they should insta-kill. Due to this, other heavy hitters like Daytime SkeletRon Prime, and the Dungeon Guardian were also brought along and made undodgeable. However, if you actually go and check in-game, you'll realize this isn't quite the case. The Empress is undodgeable, sure, and so is Dungeon Guardian, but both Daytime SkeletRon and Daytime SkeletRon Prime are perfectly dodgeable, despite the patch notes saying otherwise. So, what gives? Well, let's look at the method isDamageDodgeable, which controls whether an enemy can be dodged. First, let's replace these bare NPC IDs with the readable names from the NPC ID class. This is now what the code should have looked like to the developers before the compiler crushed it. In this switch statement, you can see that, by default, enemies are dodgeable, which makes sense. Then, the Empress of Light is dodgeable when it is not day, which also makes sense. Meanwhile, the Dungeon Guardian is only dodgeable when AI1, which is one of its internal AI counters, is not equal to 2. Since the Dungeon Guardian's internal counter is always set to 2, it's always undodgeable. Still, this makes sense. Then, there's this case. Since there's no code for this case, it quote falls through to the next case, using its code if it triggers. This means that just like the Dungeon Guardian, SkeletRon should only be dodgeable if its internal counter is not set to 2. SkeletRon's internal counter is set to 2 when he's enraged during the day, so he should be undodgeable during the day, just as intended. But if you look closely, you'll realize this is actually code for the skeleton, not SkeletRon. So yeah, that's right, Terraria's developers missed an R in their code, meaning SkeletRon is unintentionally dodgeable due to a typo. The effect of this is that SkeletRon, even during daytime, is always dodgeable, since, well, there's no exception for him in the code. However, this also means that the common blue-shirted non-bone-throwing non-boss skeleton can actually ignore dodges, if its AI counter is set to 2. While this is normally not the case, since Fighter AI uses the AI1 counter to track door-breaking progress, it is possible to create an undodgeable skeleton. If a skeleton were to bang on a tall gate once, its counter would be set to 2, and so if you run into it with a dodge, it will actually ignore your dodge. Just like that, a mere skeleton can mirror the undodgeability of the Daytime Empress, and all because of a lost R in typing. Oh, and if you're wondering, remember how he said Daytime Skeletron Prime is also unintentionally dodgeable? Well, he is, but not because of a typo or anything fancy. It's just because the developers forgot about him. He's not anywhere in the code. Just not there. Fat L for Prime, I guess. By the way, thank you to Amaboye for bringing this glitch to my attention. There's no way I could have found it otherwise. Here's a bit of trivia. If you get a shotgun and set its firing velocity to 0, that is both the weapon and the bullet, and fire it, something weird happens. Instead of the bullet just being stationary, which is what firing it at 0 velocity should do, you instead fire bullets in all directions around you, even backwards. Huh. This happens with most guns in the game, even those which aren't shotguns, and you may also notice that the speed the bullets are ejected at varies depending on the gun. A rifle like the STMG will fire bullets outwards at slower speed than a shotgun like the boomstick will. Huh. So what causes this strange behavior? Well, bullet spread. Bullet spread is the mechanic that gives guns their firing inaccuracy, so they don't fire exactly toward your cursor all the time. For rifles, bullet spread is mostly negligible and forgettable, but for other weapons it becomes a defining feature of the gun. Overall, it's a pretty simple mechanic, but the way it's implemented is what's actually quite interesting, and is what causes this weird behavior. You would expect bullet spread to work like this. When a bullet is fired from a gun, the bullet is randomly rotated by some angle. This makes each bullet fly off in slightly different trajectories when fired, creating a cone of spread, which can be controlled by changing the maximum angle. Then, if you're coding a shotgun, you can also randomize the speed of the bullets a bit so they don't all fire out next to each other, and bam! That's it, bullet spread. This is a very simple and intuitive way to implement it, and it's how it's done in most cases, but this is not actually how bullet spread in Terraria works. So, how does vanilla Terraria do it? Instead of rotating each bullet by a random amount within a set range, Terraria just adds a random velocity vector, that is, some amount of speed in some direction, to every bullet fired. For example, the boomstick spread is created by randomizing each bullet's velocity by up to 2 pixels per tick in any direction. For example, if you fired a bullet due left at 9.35 pixels per tick, it might get randomly bumped 1.142 pixels per tick in this direction, or 0.541 pixels per tick in this direction, or 1.942 pixels per tick in this direction. You get the idea. This creates a randomization effect that works great as bullet spread, and also has the added bonus of randomizing velocity, so shotguns work nicely, just like we did before. It's a method that's a bit different than expected, but it's also a 2-in-1 solution that functions well. Interestingly, this way of creating bullet spread also means that the more base velocity your gun fires at, the less spread it will have, since the effect of randomization is lesser. Though this has no practical application in game, it is interestingly separate from the standard method of bullet spread, where a fixed angle is used. So to get back to the start, why does this different method of bullet spread create this weird effect at 0 velocity? Well, when you try to add a random amount of speed in a random direction to a bullet fired at 0 velocity, which should be stationary, it just ends up moving in that random direction with that random speed. Effectively, the effect of randomization is 100%. As this random direction is, of course, random, the bullets just end up scattering outwards slowly in all directions like this. Guns with more spread, like shotguns, have their scattering bullets move faster, since more spread equals more randomization equals faster scattering in this case. So, this is how this rather weird phenomenon works. Overall, it's a rather interesting byproduct of an obscure but succinct way of implementing bullet spread, and one of the more obscure bits of trivia I've covered on this channel. Dust is all around us, not just in real life, but also in Terraria. If you've played this game longer than a few seconds, you've probably seen and are aware of dust. I mean, load into a world and bam, there it is. Dust is a unique visual effect used by many things in Terraria to spice up the look of the game. It basically consists of an extremely small, typically 2x2 to 4x4 sprite, which is drawn somewhere on screen. You can control what sprite is used for the dust particle by choosing a dust type. There are 324 built-in dust types in the game, plus whatever you decide to mod in. Once you determine that, you can modify the dust particle by setting its position, initial velocity, size, light emission, and color to get the effect you want. Oh, and if it wasn't obvious, the dust type also controls the dust's behavior after it spawns in. Most dusts just fizzle out over time by decreasing their scale, but I guess this one doesn't, or at least it acts unintentionally when spawned in with my random dust gun's parameters. But yeah, dust controls dust behavior. Using dust has many advantages. First, unlike projectiles and NPCs, it is intangible, meaning it has no effect on gameplay. It is a purely visual effect. Second, it is very lightweight. Up to 6,000 dusts can exist in the world simultaneously, compared to just 1,000 projectiles or 200 NPCs, so you can work with more at once. It is extremely difficult, though possible, to lag the game using dust. And third, it is very versatile. For any effect your particles suffice, the customizability of dust particles should make it work. This is why dust particles show themselves everywhere. There are the obvious examples like Hermes boots, which spawn large cloud dust particles whenever you're running quickly, the mana refresh, which spawns a burst of blue to notify you that you've reached full mana, the smoke trail of a rocket, which is pretty self-evident, or all the mining particles that show up whenever you mine anything. There's quite a few of those. Then there are less obvious examples, like the breath bubbles your character mix when you're underwater, the sparks that give extra light to torches, the crumbs that come off eating food, the buzz of a lightning aura sentry, the sliminess of a slime, or the confetti of a party popper, just to name a few. The least obvious cases may be in weapons or ammunition. For example, the chlorophyte bullet you know and love isn't an actual bullet, but instead a trail of dust. To create the bullet's streak, the bullet simply spawns a glowing green dust particle every update at its position, so 180 times a second. This line of particles follows the path of the bullet, creating the streak we're all so familiar with. You can actually see the real bullet here when firing this shotgun, followed by the dust trail. The projectile itself is actually pretty obvious, though given how fast the bullets travel, you barely notice it. I sometimes still wonder why they didn't make it invisible though, like in our next example. The Shadow Beam Staff and other similar weapons also use dust, but as the projectile is invisible, the entirety of the beam is made of dust particles. For those not aware, the Shadow Beam Staff is not a hit scan weapon, but instead spawns an incredibly fast moving projectile that traces out the path of the beam. Like this, but 100 times faster. The beam projectile travels over 100 tiles in under 3 ticks, which makes the beam feel nearly instant. Wherever this invisible shadow beam travels, it spawns a glowing purple dust particle at a location somewhere near it. As it travels through 300 updates in 1/20th of a second, these dust particles show up as a thin shadow beam trail following the path of the projectile, which is what we see. So, that's a brief summary of dust. Like a shake of pepper onto anything, it gives Terraria a little bit of spice that makes it feel more alive. It's small, literally, but still very important. Blood and gore, one of the more carnal aspects of this generally kid-friendly block game. Most of us know Gore as those NPC sprite fragments that spawn and fade away shortly after killing most enemies. Gore adds to the flavor of the Terraria murder experience, playing a pivotal role in the satisfaction of mowing down hordes of goblins or sniping the last bit of life out of the Empress. But what is blood and gore, really? What it is isn't familiar to most Terrarians. It certainly isn't a projectile like the arrows you shoot or the minions you summon, nor is it an NPC like that zombie or slime over there, so what is it? Well, if you've watched my previous Dust video, you'll probably know where I'm going. Gore is its own type of entity in Terraria, with unique behavior, limits, and toggles. It's certainly a non-off-talk-about subject, even lacking a wiki page beyond the list of Gore IDs. So, in this video, let's talk a bit about Gore, blood, and the interesting nuances of the blood and gore setting. Blood and gore, as a mechanic, is made of two things, blood and gore, respectively. Blood, put simply, is basically just dust particles. It's a particle effect. Dust IDs 5, 227, and 273 are considered to be types of blood for certain enemies. Whenever you hit a fleshy kind of enemy, blood particles will spawn, and when you kill them, blood will gush out too. That's blood. Gores, meanwhile, are those big lumps of dismembered enemy that spawn after killing an enemy. Unlike blood, gore is its own unique type of object created for this purpose. Gore acts very similarly to dust particles, but is scaled up to support much larger sprites, so it can be used for more than just particle generation. Blood dust particles and gore objects are spawned upon killing most enemies as an effect. For example, when I killed a zombie, you can see the blood particles gushing out and the gore spawning on top. That's blood and gore working in tandem. While blood dust is a pretty small and insignificant flavor effect, the gore object goes far beyond just enemy carnage. Gore is an incredibly versatile tool. It's essentially a sprite effect with custom behavior, basically like the dust particle generator but with larger sprites. As such, the Terraria devs use Gore for far more than just its named purpose. It permeates pretty much every aspect of the game in places you'd never imagine. For example, the star cannon. When you fire the star cannon, little yellow and blue stars appear in the pathway of the shooting stars. Those are Gores, types 16 and 17 respectively. Confetti, like those from the party bullet and confetti gun, are also Gores, although some confetti dust is mixed in too. Bubbles from the bubble machine are also Gores, as are the water drips from underground lakes, pop fragments, the crowns of the slime princes, the falling leaves from trees on a windy day, the cloud in a bottle, echo mist, or the blue music notes coming out of an activated music box. Oh, and the shit coming out of a toilet is also Gore. Before we end, we should also cover the blood and gore toggle setting. Internally called child safety, whenever this setting is toggled off, any dust or gores not marked as safe will be replaced with clouds. All three blood dust particles are not marked safe. In fact, they are the only dust particles not marked safe. So with blood and gore toggled off, they are replaced with dust particle 16, or clouds. There are a lot more unsafe gores, as pretty much any enemy carcass fragments are marked unsafe, but they work much the same. When blood and gore is toggled off, any unsafe gores are randomly changed to type 11 through 13, which are the same clouds that come out of the cloud in a bottle, masking the effect. This part of the blood and gore toggle is fairly unremarkable, but what was more interesting is what gores are marked safe and which ones aren't. Now, non-death gores like the ones we mentioned earlier are all marked safe because they're simply visual effects, but when it comes to death gores, what is and isn't safe can sometimes be a bit inconsistent. For example, mechanical object fragments are typically marked as safe gores because they aren't bloody. Despite this, retinaser and spasmatism's gores are not marked safe, unlike the rest of the mechanical bosses. I guess those blood vessel wires were too much. Similarly, Sandtank 1's face, carapace, and machine gun are not considered safe gores, but his treads are, for some reason. This means if you kill Sandtank 1 with blood and gore toggled off, you get a bunch of shredded treads, but no body pieces. Looks quite strange. King Slime's crown is considered a safe gore, but Queen Slime's isn't, even if both of them are equally tame and sparkly. All of Golem's broken fragments are considered safe, except for this single black fragment gore for some reason. I don't even know what this is. And lastly, perhaps the most puzzling one. This is the wall creeper. I'm sure you're all familiar with him. Wall creeper legs and abdomens are considered unsafe, which seems reasonable. After all, it is a spider, which can sometimes be a bit creepy. However, its big brother, the Black Recluse, which is basically the same enemy, has its legs and abdomens considered safe. They do show up with blood and gore turned off. This one truly boggles the mind. Why is this different? Hell, I don't know. Both of them are even next to each other in the Gore ID table. You'd think they'd be set the same way. Relogic, please fix. Everything in Terraria is secretly a projectile. Well, not everything, that's hyperbole, but a lot more is a projectile than you'd think at first glance. For example, this is a projectile. Now, that should be obvious, given that it is a projectile in the traditional sense, but what about this? Or this? These absolutely aren't projectiles in any traditional sense, but in-game, they are projectiles nonetheless. This is because of how broad and versatile projectiles in Terraria are. Projectiles are objects that are both tangible, meaning they can affect combat, yet non-interactive, meaning they are mostly autonomous. Projectiles are also generally persistent for however long you need them to be. This contrasts them with dust and gore, which are intangible and generally time-limited, and NPCs, which are able to be directly interacted with by the player, like with talking or HP. This category of non-interactive, yet tangible and persistent objects is a large and important one in Terraria. Despite being non-interactive, projectiles can still have complex, persistent AI, meaning they're perfect for any entity that doesn't need player interaction, which is, well, most of them. For example, all pets are actually projectiles. You want a pet to have a complex AI to do pet things and be persistent, unlike Gore's, yet you don't need a pet to be interactive with stuff like menus, HP values, or the like. In this case, a projectile works perfectly, despite pets being distinctly not projectiles in the common sense. Likewise, minions and sentries are also all projectiles, since like pets they need complex and persistent AI, but don't care about interactiveness given their plug-and-play nature and invincibility. Honestly, minions are basically just pets, but with damage values. It's also pretty common for weapons to be projectiles. And no, I'm not talking about the product of the weapon or the thing it shoots, I'm talking about the weapon itself. An example is how all spears are actually projectiles. This is because when in use, spear sprites need to be a lot longer than their item sprites would allow, otherwise they would be pretty crappy to use. If a standard use animation was used, then the game would use the default item sprite, which is too short. So instead, the game skips that and spawns a projectile with the longer sprite instead. This allows spears to be nice and compact in your hotbar, yet be plenty long for combat elsewhere. In this vein, all weapons and items that need non-standard use animations are generally rendered in use as projectiles. Just as a few examples, short swords are changed to use projectiles in 1.4 to accommodate their ability to stab in all directions. All drills, chainsaws, and jackhammers are projectiles, due to their persistent nature, as are yo-yos for the same reason. Ranged weapons with special abilities are also often implemented as projectiles. The Phantom Phoenix, Vortex Speeder, Celebration Mark II, and Phantasm are all actually projectiles in use, likely due to their need for special abilities. 3 of them also have an animation in use, which would be impossible to implement using standard use styles and item sprites. There are also a few other examples of sprite animations necessitating projectiles like this. Using projectiles to do weapon rendering like this also leads to the rather funny scenario where these ranged weapons actually deal contact damage. This is because projectiles are still tangible objects with hitboxes, but that's a topic for another video I already made. In summary, using a projectile to render a weapon just gives you so much more versatility than using a standard preset static use animation. Aside from weapons, there's also a few more assorted interesting examples. All grappling hooks are actually projectiles, although I suppose they are projectiles in the traditional sense too for a bit after they're fired. The wire blueprints you place down to the grand design are projectiles, and if you spawn one manually, it creates a line of wire extending to the end of the world for some reason. Fishing bobbers are all projectiles, as are whips and the quad racer drone. Boss cosmetics, like the Lunatic Cultist's Circle and the Aurora around the Empress, are also projectiles. And falling sand, dirt, mud, and ash, although short-lived, are also projectiles as needed to be tangible and deal damage. The same goes for tombstones, although I guess they didn't get to use that deal damage part until For the Worthy. That was a large, but not exhaustive list of how projectiles are used in Terraria. They cover quite a lot. It's quite interesting. If I had to take any trivia away from this video, it would be that portals are projectiles, but the Vile Spit isn't. The portal is a projectile for the many reasons I've already gone over, but why isn't it clearly projectile Vile Spit? Well, it's because they need to be destructible. You can parry them to destroy them before they reach you. This behavior requires an HP value, an NPC-only feature, which is why they aren't projectiles, but NPCs. So that's why the Vile Spit is the most projectile-like projectile that isn't, while the portal is the least projectile-like projectile that is. A brand new Terraria player file should be around 3.5 kilobytes in size. Less than a third the size of a blank Word document, player data in Terraria is essentially negligible in size. After all, there just isn't that much unique player information that has to be stored in the file, and what information does need to be stored doesn't take up much space. Most player files should be roughly the same size as a new one, that is, around 3 to 5 kilobytes. However, there's still a variance. As you see, some files are simply larger than others. Some players just take more space than others to store. That begs the question then, how large can a player file get? There should be a combination of settings or flags or whatever in a player that makes the largest possible save. Furthermore, how large would the biggest save file be? 50 kilobytes? 100? Maybe a megabyte? Well, let's see. How big do you think it'll be? The size of a player file actually depends on just a few factors, since most of the file is actually made of pre-allocated static blocks. For example, buff data is always stored in this block of 352 bytes, right here. 8 bytes per buff, 4 for the buff ID, 4 for duration, times 44 total buff slots. Even if you have no buffs, the game will still store the buff data for all 44 buff slots, even if it's 352 0 bytes in a row. Most of the file is made of allocated data blocks like this, used to store all sorts of things. Since our goal is making the largest player file, we can safely ignore these static blocks, since they're always going to be the same size. Instead, we can focus on maximizing the size of the data that is variable in size. If we maximize the size of the variable size information and we know the rest of the player file is of constant size, then we'll know we have made the largest possible player file. So what are the variable data we need to look at and maximize? Well, there are 4: player name, research, spawn points, and mouse items. Player name is our first and most obvious variable length data point. After all, different players have names of different lengths. To maximize the space used to add a player name, we just have to make it as long as possible. When typing the name in Terraria, player names can be up to 20 characters long. Yes, I know they can be longer when externally edited, but I'll be sticking to the longest possible in-game. While this may be the longest name, we can still use more space by maximizing the space used per character. We can accomplish this by using Unicode characters, namely Chinese Hanzi, as they are actually supported by Terraria. In the UTF-8 encoding format that Terraria uses, Chinese characters take 3 bytes per character versus just 1 for Latin text, meaning that our 20 character name now takes up 60 bytes instead of just 20. That's maximization of the player name data right there. Now that we have a player with 20 Chinese characters as its name, we can now consider research. Research data is stored near the end of the player file and is basically a list of every researched item's name followed by the quantity researched for that item. What's interesting is that the item names are stored as text, not IDs like everywhere else in the file. This means storing research in the player file is supremely inefficient. A fully researched character with all 5,389 researchable items uses 99,222 bytes to store its research data. That's 18.41 bytes per item, which is over twice as inefficient as just storing data using int item IDs like the rest of the file. Honestly, I have no clue why they decided to do this. Either way, I'm not complaining. After all, we kind of want inefficiency right now. As by far the largest section of the player file, adding research to a journey mode character balloons our character's file size by a factor of 28, to approximately 103 kilobytes. Next is spawn points. Interestingly, your spawn points in each world are not actually stored in the world file, but instead are on the player file. Spawn points are stored right before the research data and consist of the spawn point's coordinates, the world's world ID, and the world name. Like the rest of these, there's no pre-allocated block for spawn points. Instead, the game reads as many spawn points as it can before it hits a block of 4 FF bytes, which basically tells it to stop, as there are no spawn points anymore. Theoretically, this means a player file should be able to store an infinite number of spawn points, but there's actually a hard arbitrary limit of 200 spawn points per player since the array is only 200 long. Sad. Either way, we have 200 spawn points to fill up. As these spawn points store the world name as a string, we'll set world names in each to the max of 27 Chinese characters to maximize the space taken by each entry, similar to the player name. Add 200 of these uber Chinese spawn points, and bam, we have a max spawn point character. At this point, our character is around 121 kilobytes in size. This is very close to our maximum size, but we can pick out a few more bytes using this, the mouse item. You know how you can pick up items with your mouse and kinda keep them there? Well, they're actually stored there as well. The cursor is the unofficial 59th slot of the inventory and gets some storage space of its own. If you log out with anything on your mouse, in the Goblin Tinker, research menu, or guide menu, that item is actually not deleted. Instead, it is logged inside the player file itself so that it may be retrieved when you log back in. This is not pre-allocated space, and thus, if you log out with anything on your mouse, your player file will have some bytes more than normal. So, to finally max out our player file size, we log in, open the Goblin Tinker, put an item inside, hold something on the mouse, and log out. This is logged to our file right here, and opening it reveals our file's true final size, 121,792 bytes. It's still not a significant size, being the size of a very crappy JPEG, but hey, it did it well. If you've perused the wiki a lot, you've probably seen these, the NPC ID numbers. Basically, these are the static numbers used to refer to each NPC type within the code of the game, starting from ID 1, the blue slime, all the way to ID 687, the mystic frog. However, the more perceptive of you might have noticed these as well, the negative NPC ID numbers. Yeah, NPC IDs don't just count upwards as new NPCs are added, but special negative IDs exist too. They're used as aliases for variants of enemies, like how the purple slime's ID -7 is just an alias that spawns a blue slime with stronger stats in a different color, or how the small Twiggy zombie is just a smaller and lower HP version of the regular Twiggy zombie. In total, there are 65 of these NPC variants, all size, stat, and/or color-scaled versions of their original counterparts, all assigned a negative ID, presumably for easier development. All of this is somewhat well known, but what is less well known are the negative item IDs. To find them, you'll have to look into the Terraria source code. In the item ID class, you'll find that item IDs -48 through -1 are used for, quote, old versions of the metal pickaxes, axes, hammers, bows, and swords, as well as old versions of all the phase sabers. While they are still in the game, unlike their actively used NPC counterparts, these negative ID items seem to be completely deprecated from the game, with absolutely no way to obtain them. If you spawn them via an inventory editor or a server command, you get an item that functions exactly like the new version of the item it's replacing, and if you save and exit, it gets replaced with the new version. Basically, in modern Terraria, these items are not only unobtainable, but unstable. That makes you wonder, why were these added and what were they used for, and when were they removed and deprecated? Clearly it has something to do with legacy versions of Terraria, given their naming in the source code, but for what reason would Relogic remake a bunch of mundane basic weapons and tools? Well, the answer lies in these: sprites. Before 1.3, sprites in Terraria were a lot more basic. It's programmer art, if you will. One aspect of this was recoloring. Back then, all metal item sprites, bows, swords, pickaxes, etc., were just straight recolors of the appropriate tool or weapon made of iron. You can see this in the fact that every tool's shape is the same, and also in the tool's different handle colors. Since the recolor tint filter affects the whole sprite, the handles change color too. As all of these items are basically just versions of the same item, just with different tints and stats, Relogic probably thought it was best to include these as sub-items, separate from standard items, and so negative item IDs were born. Just like the negative NPC IDs assigned to modified variants of existing NPCs, negative item IDs were assigned to modified variants of existing items. These copper, silver, and gold tools occupied the first 18 negative item IDs until phase sabers were introduced in 1.1. Each phase saber had literally the exact same sprite as the corresponding phase blade, and as each phase saber is just a stat buffed copy of their corresponding phase blade, Relogic decided to use variants for that too. And bam, another 6 negative ID items were added. The last 24 negative ID items were added in version 1.2, when the alternate pre-hardened ores, tin, lead, tungsten, and platinum were added. Just like their non-alternate brethren, these ores tools were just recolors too, and as such they got their negative IDs. In total, Terraria ended up with 48 of these negative ID variant items, added presumably to save time, but their time was not long. Version 1.3 caused a downfall for most of these negative ID items. With the big update, Relogic decided to give unique sprites to all the old metal tools and weapons, with the sparkles and actually brown handles and all. So the variants and recolors had to go. Every metal tool and weapon was upgraded to be its own item and thus have its own sprite, not just a recolor of some other sprite. You can see that this was done in 1.3 by the tool's item ID numbers. They're around 3,500 next to all the other 1.3 editions like Solar Die and the Stardust Dragon Staff. This is unusual. Normally, basic stuff like this would be in the early 100s as they were added earlier, even at release. But these items were only upgraded in 1.3, so they have rather late item ID numbers even if they were introduced much earlier. Something similar happened to phase sabers in 1.3.2, but for a different reason. Apparently there was a bug where phase sabers placed on weapon racks would be unbreakable, so they fixed it by just making phase sabers a different item. You can tell they did this when they said that, quote, "This fix is not retroactive and will not fix old rules impacted by the issue. Making new phase sabers only affects future phase sabers and those that will be updated in the inventory, so existing bugged weapon racks would be left unaffected with a legacy phase saber." Instead of just being stat buffed copies, phase sabers were upgraded into their own set of items. Relogic also conveniently decided to make the hidden change of giving them sprites this update as well, finally bringing them to the 1.3 standard. I guess it was time for that anyway, and it must have been nice to finally deprecate this old feature. With that, every item got its sprite and no item remained as a variant any longer. Negative item IDs found themselves in use from 1.1 to 1.3.2, although they're still technically in the game for legacy support reasons. In case someone wants to bring a pre-1.3.2 character into a modern version of Terraria, the game needs to be able to interpret and update these old items properly. Without any item variants in the game, there's no reason to reintroduce them, but they remain an interesting and extremely obscure part of Terraria's history. If you know anything about ammunition stats in Terraria, it is that they are generally additive. If you fire a Jester's Arrow with a base damage of 10 from an Orichalcum Repeater with a base damage of 40, the final product deals 50 damage. If you fire an Unholy Arrow with a base velocity of 3.4 from a Chlorophyte Shotbow with a base velocity of 11.5, the shot arrow travels at a velocity of 14.9. If you fire an Explosive Bullet with a knockback of 6.6 from a Shotgun with a knockback of 6.5, the dealt knockback will be 13.1. Yet, despite this, Critical Strike is an exception. Only the weapon's Critical Strike applies, while the ammunition's has completely no effect. Of course, this is to prevent double counting, otherwise it would be possible to obtain a guaranteed Critical Strike chance at just 50% CC. So then, why does the ammunition item display a Critical Strike chance at all? As the stat on ammo is completely useless, it shouldn't be there as an inconsistency, and given that it is, it also has the possibility of being somewhat confusing for new players. Surely it should be removed, but clearly, it stays. So, why? Well, it's because fundamentally, weapons and ammo are kind of the same thing. At their core, both of them are items that have their ranged flag activated, which defines them as ranged items and allows them to benefit from generic and ranged damage boosts. The only differences between weapons and ammo are that ammo has the ammo attribute, which allows it to be used as ammo, and that ammo items don't have a defined use style, meaning they can't be used directly from the hotbar. Change any of these, and weapons and ammo can behave just like each other. They are quite literally very similar. So, since item shares the ranged flag with weapons, it also inherits the same type behavior as ranged weapons. By default, all ranged items show their damage and crit stats in the tooltip since, well, weapons need to show that information. Thus, ammo shows this information too, even if it's extraneous for this purpose. Essentially, this whole thing is a side effect of being in the ranged item group with weapons. Okay then, how can this be remedied? Well, we can't move ammunition out of the ranged item group, since ammunition needs to benefit from generic and ranged item boosts, just like weapons. That's kind of important. Instead, we should make the ammo attribute prevent certain stats, like Critical Strike, from appearing. Terraria already does this to hide ammo items' use time, which is hidden when use style is not set, like on ammo items. There's no reason why the ammo attribute can't be modified to do something similar and hide CC stats on all ammo items too. Just like that, ammo has become much cleaner and, more importantly, less confusing. The next step after this would be to add velocity to the tooltip, since for some reason that is still hidden, but I don't know. While all of this is quite minor, I do actually hope someday that it may happen. If you look up velocity in the Terraria wiki, you'll find a section on this, extra updates. Now what this section basically says is that extra updates acts as a kind of velocity multiplier. If a projectile is fired at 6 velocity, then giving it 1 extra update will make it fire at 12 velocity. Every extra update simply multiplies the total base velocity. Pretty simple. And yes, extra updates does do that. It does multiply velocity in the way that it's described, and frankly, that's all you need to know. The only time normal Terrarians actually need to care for extra updates is with the Magic Quiver, which doubles projectile velocity when using arrows that don't have a velocity multiplier. So when using the Magic Quiver, you need to be aware of which arrows have extra updates and which don't, but otherwise it's a completely hidden facet of the game. However, I am not a normal Terrarian. I'm an unhelpable nerd. If you look beyond the surface game, you can find that extra updates has a lot more effects than just multiplying velocity. And that's what I'm talking about today. So what is an extra update? Well, it's in the name, extra update. Every tick, or 1/60th of a second, projectiles in Terraria update. This means moving forward, dealing damage, disappearing, transforming, whatever is in their AI. Extra updates just mean that projectile updates extra times. 1 extra update means you'll update twice per tick instead of once, 2 extra updates means 3 times per tick, and so on. By the way, this is why it acts like a velocity multiplier. If you update twice in a tick, you move twice per tick, and thus move twice the distance per tick. We observe this as a doubling in speed since the tick rate is always constant. So then, knowing that, why would we ever use extra updates? Why can't we just simply increase the projectile's velocity instead of using some gank multiplier? Well, granularity. Take, for instance, the high velocity bullet. It has a velocity multiplier of x8, which is the second highest in the game, only behind the Shadow Beam staff, which we'll talk about later. When fired from, say, an STMG, the high velocity bullet fires at an effective velocity of 128, or 8 blocks per tick. Ludicrously fast. But if we have the high velocity bullet move at 128 velocity without extra updates, then it'll be here in 1 tick and 8 blocks that way in the next. Anything between just gets skipped over. It's like the bullet just teleported through it, since it's moving so fast. Instead, if we have 7 extra updates, it only moves a single block per update, so things in between still have the opportunity to be hit. This allows us to move our projectile more continuously without sacrificing the final speed of the projectile, because remember, Terraria is discrete. Another application of this is in the Shadow Beam staff. If you didn't know, the Shadow Beam staff is actually just a single hyperfast tracer bouncing around, like this. This tracer bounces around and creates the beam path. This tracer travels so fast that its journey is nearly unnoticeable, completing its path in under 0.05 seconds, and the dust it leaves behind is what forms the beam that you and I normally recognize. This bouncing tracer could only work with the granularity of extra updates. After all, the tracer travels 38 blocks in a single tick. Without extra updates, the beam would look like this. If it could only update its position 3 times, there's no way it could bounce at all and would basically teleport through the world. So Relogic gave the Shadow Beam staff a relatively low velocity of 6, but 100 extra updates, so updates 101 times per tick. Traveling just 3/8 of a block per update, it actually has enough granularity to bounce like a normal slower projectile would, and thus is able to create the bouncing beam we all recognize. Cases like this show that sometimes even 1/60th of a second is too long, and we need 1/6000th of a second to work better. Besides velocity though, extra updates also has 2 other effects: damage and immunity frames. After all, updating a projectile twice doesn't just mean updating position twice, but running its code twice as well. For damage, this means that contrary to popular belief, you can attack things multiple times in 1 tick. For example, here's a bullet I've modded to have 0 velocity and 199 extra updates. This bullet can, and will, deal 12,000 ticks of damage per second. Yes, this is an actual thing that is possible from a single projectile. As far as I can tell though, the only time this damage thing has actually made it into the base game was with the Celebration Mark II in 1.4.3.6. This is because normally immunity frames mean that projectiles can't hit the same enemy more than once per X updates, but in this case the devs made a little bit of a mistake. Relogic accidentally fat-fingered the Red Rocket's immunity frame code, so they actually had 0 immunity frames instead of 10 like the other rockets. With no immunity frames to block attacks and 2 extra updates, these Red Rockets could effectively hit a target 3 times per tick. Obviously, this led to some balanced engagements. Fortunately or unfortunately, this was fixed in 1.4.4. Speaking of immunity frames, extra updates affects that too. It turns out that local immunity counts down per update, not per projectile. This means that projectiles with extra updates have shorter immunity than you might think. An example of this is the Zenith. It has 15 local immunity frames, so a single Zenith Sword instance shouldn't be able to hit the same target more than 4 times per second. However, since the Zenith has 1 extra update, the period of immunity is actually 7.5 ticks, not 15, meaning the Zenith Sword instance can actually hit a single target up to 8 times per second. Double rate countdown, half the immunity frames. Now, in the case with the Zenith, it's likely that this was intentional, so no worries here. However, if you're reading Terraria's code for understanding or looking to make a mod, you should really understand extra update's effect on immunity frames. Half the immunity can mean double the damage in certain instances, and that can really throw off balance. You don't want that. So that's it for this video covering the facets of extra updates, one of Terraria's hidden stats. Its effects are quite subtle but integral to the functionality of the game. Quite interesting.